Hey, good afternoon, everyone. We'll be starting the session shortly. We're just waiting for a few more people to join. Okay, numbers have slowed now, so I think we'll make a start. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the first session of the 2026 GW4 Open Research Week. A few housekeeping points before we start. The session is being recorded, as all sessions will be this week, and will be available on the GW4 YouTube channel in due course. Once our speakers have delivered their talk, there should be time for questions before the end, so please add any questions you have to the Q&A section as we go along. So welcome, and we're very pleased so many of you are able to join us this afternoon. I'm Kelly Snow, Research Data Manager from Cardiff University Library Service and lead for this year's Open Research Week Planning Group. So this is the third consecutive year where the universities of Bath, Bristol, Cardiff and Exeter, under the GW4 umbrella, have worked together with GW4 itself to deliver a programme of events exploring how open research practices can enhance cultures, transparency, collaboration, research integrity and real-world impact. I'm delighted to be introducing today's keynote session, delivered by Science Europe, and highlighting the findings of a 3-year consultation with its public research funding and performing member organisations, exploring the intersection of open science and research assessment reform. Now, the relationship between open research and wider research culture has been an important and consistent thread woven throughout every GW4 Open Research Week to date, so we're most excited to now learn more from that wider international and policy perspective. Our speakers for today are Dr. Bregt Saenen and Dr. James Morris. Dr. Bregt Saenen serves as Senior Policy Officer for Open Science at Science Europe. With extensive experience in membership and policy organisations, he's held roles at the European University Association, the European Commission, Solidaire and the EU Office of the International Labour Organization. He earned his doctorate in EU Studies and a Master of Science in EU Studies from Ghent University in Belgium, where he also completed a Bachelor and Master of Arts in History. Additionally, he was a visiting researcher at New York University in the United States. Dr. James Morris is a Senior Policy Officer at Science Europe. He joined Science Europe in 2019 and has a background in marine and molecular biology. He was a Marie Curie Actions Postdoctoral Fellow at the Royal Belgian Institute of Natural Sciences and holds a PhD in molecular biology from the University of Southampton. At Science Europe, he leads the organisation's work on the topics of research culture and research assessment and has developed policy positions and recommendations aimed broadly at improving conditions for researchers and the research endeavour. He's also a member of the drafting team of the Carrara Agreement. So, a very warm welcome to you both, Bregt and James, and over to you.
Thank you very much, Kelly, and good afternoon to everybody. It's our pleasure to be with you today, talking a bit about some of our recent work on connecting our policy agendas and priorities on open science and research assessment reform. I hope you can now see the slides I'm presenting clearly, and I'll jump straight to the next slide, although we've already been introduced. I'm James Morris, and at Science Europe, I deal with all our work relating to research cultures, which includes research assessment reform, but also career aspects, integrity and ethics, EDI, and importantly, how they intersect. Correct.
Yes, also delighted to be here. My name is Bregt Saenen. I'm Senior Policy Officer for Open Science, so I take care of the Open Science portfolio. This has been something that has been with Science Europe since the very beginning. We started with a focus on open access to publications, later also data and have now, since 2021, taken a step forward to really consider open science as a more comprehensive ambition. And I'm sure you're going to see a lot of elements of that in the presentation we're about to give.
Indeed. Firstly, a little bit about Science Europe for those that don't know us. So we're a membership organisation based in Brussels. We have 40 member organisations from across 30 European countries, comprising predominantly research funding organisations, but also a number of research performing organisations. And we bring our members and their experts together to discuss policy and practice advances. Our membership includes, for example, in the UK Research and Innovation, and then equivalent organisations from around Europe, like the German Research Foundation or the Icelandic Research Centre. We have, over the past 6 years, structured our work according to 3 main strategic priorities. Firstly, focusing on European research policy developments. Also looking at strengthening the role and contribution of science to tackling societal challenges, and then right in the middle there on the slide, contributing to the evolution of research culture. And although I think what we present today fits across all 3 of those levels, the focus has really been centered on the contribution to the evolution of research cultures. So what do we mean when we say research culture? That was a question that we asked ourselves when it became a strategic priority for us back in 2021. And I should say from the outset, and as shown in this slide, we took a lot of inspiration from the discussions that had been already quite mature at that time in the UK. Many other national systems across Europe had not used the term research culture, didn't understand exactly what it meant at that time. And I really like this image by the Royal Society because it captures what we now, as Science Europe, after 5 or 6 years working on the topic, understand as culture. And that is that it's a really complex set of behaviors, attitudes, norms, and values that shape and interact with one another across a variety of different policy topics. So it affects careers, integrity and ethics, EDI, also open science. And we want to keep that complexity and use it in our policy discussions. And the project that we'll present today hopefully gives a bit of a flavour of how we've developed that through our work in recent years. But as a starting point, we wanted to see where we could kick off our research culture discussions with our members. And we felt that going to the kind of the base level, the foundation of what we understand as research culture would be a good starting point. And that was, what are our shared values? And over the process of about 1.5 years with all our member organizations, we discussed what are the core values that across the European research area we think are really key to research policies and practices, but also the research endeavor more generally. And we came together around these 6 shared values, which were common across all our member organizations. So this is not to say that there are other values that are not important, that might be emphasized more in some regions than others, but these are the 6 values that all our members agree are really at the core and the foundation of what they do to support their research communities. And that will also come back later in one of the slides as the basis for some of our more recent work.
Yes, and just quickly taking over from James here from the side of Open Science, before we move on with the actual results of our consultation that we've done with our members in the last 3 years, we just quickly wanted to give you a sense also of like, how do we look at open science at a high level? How do we look at research assessment reform? And just on this slide, there is a lot to say about open science. Open science is a very comprehensive mission. It's a sprawling field, but luckily it is possible to sort of have a very high level summary of what it is that's important and what is that we're talking about with open science. I have made an effort here. The first one, growing ambition, I think is very important in terms of what my colleague James just said. open science, if we talk open science or open research, we are using these interchangeably, is a much more comprehensive, much more ambitious effort than just open access to either publications, data, or other research outputs. Open access is a core element of open science, is one of the more mature elements of it. But open science really looks beyond, looks at the whole of the research process and how that can be made open. And also, very importantly, how open science can contribute to, as we were just talking about, to furthering like more positive research cultures. That growing ambition, to really see it, you have to look no further than a quick comparison of the Berlin Declaration that came out in 2003 and the UNESCO recommendation that came out in 2021. These are documents that came out about 20 years apart, and if you go through them, the Berlin Declaration was incredibly important in putting open access on the map. But if you compare it to the broad sweeping ambition that speaks from the UNESCO recommendation about 20 years later, you just see that ambition that has grown, the maturity in that community. So that is one big thing to understand about open science / research, is that it's a much more ambitious, comprehensive effort. That also means that open science now really is becoming a driver of research cultures grounded in shared values. We started with that emphasis on research culture. One of the things where you can really see that in open science is the last 4 years, especially the emphasis on diamond open access, which is a model, a community-owned model of open access that basically says, well, publishing should be free both for authors and it should be free to read. It should be free for authors and readers, and all of the core infrastructure should be community-owned, community-led. That is not just saying open access at all costs. That is really saying open access should adhere to the values that we hold dear within the research community. So that is a really good example of that. Another good example there is public infrastructures that are being built. Open Research Europe was just relaunched. Well, the consortium behind it was just relaunched, and it's going to go into its new phase later this year, the European Open Science Cloud. There is these public infrastructures where the public has a say on how open science and open scholarly publishing is shaped. So open science becoming a driver for all of that. And at the same time, open science is now something that we see, especially at EU level, but also in various national capitals. It is contributing to more and more progressive research and innovation policies. Open science is on the political map right now in Brussels. We are obviously very busy with the next framework program. We are very busy with building the European Research Area through the European Research Area Act. And there are these EU policy drivers that might be very similar in the UK as well. Competitiveness, research security, research sovereignty, artificial intelligence. We're seeing that open science has matured to a level where also in that political arena, in that policy arena, it can speak out and contribute to those types of policies and make a real and effective contribution. So that, in a nutshell, is just how we understand open science now. What are the big trends we are seeing today? And then I'm handing it over back to my colleague, James.
Yes, and in terms of research assessment, this is, of course, a long-standing priority at Science Europe. It represents the real core business of all our member organizations in terms of research assessment for funding allocation, but also amongst our performing members, research assessment for career progression exercises like hiring and promotion. And the priority on research assessment has been a global reform process, and I hope that many of you have now heard about COARA, the Coalition for Advancing Research Assessment. Science Europe was involved in the initiation, development and early running of that coalition, and all of our activity around research assessment reform points in that direction, with the priorities really being how can we change the assessment systems internationally to better recognize the diverse skills that researchers bring to their daily work and the contributions they make to the research endeavor, how we can move from assessment based primarily on quantitative metrics, often poor proxies of research quality, to more qualitative assessment processes that better capture those skills and contributions, and how can we try and remove the many perverse incentives that are in the traditional system that we're moving away from, like publish or perish. And that is really captured in the Kawara movement, which I think nearly 90% of our members are now signatories of, and that is the key focus of our work on reforming research assessment.
Yes, and just taking it over again for a brief moment here is we're going to skip to the end of the presentation for just one slide. We're going to start at the end here, a shared vision. What we've done at Science Europe, what you'll hear about for the rest of the presentation is we have basically done a 3-year project together with our members, together with academic partners, where we wanted to really dig in and get a good sense of what open science and research assessment reform means to our members and what is out there in the academic literature. We're going to go through all of our findings, so the most relevant findings of that. But before we do, just skipping to the end, where do we ultimately end up? I think that's really good to just start from the end there, is we end up with a shared vision that will be published at the end of this month in a project, in a report, where basically we truly bring together open science and research assessment reform, not as two separate elements that are building and supporting positive research cultures, but also really how open science and research assessment reform can work together to be more effective at building the type of research cultures that we would like to see. That is this shared vision. One sentence that I really want to point out here in this sort of text that we've taken from the report is in the second paragraph, where we say open science broadens the creation and circulation of knowledge, fostering transparency, inclusivity, and meaningful engagement with society. I think, again, that shows you the level of comprehensive ambition that speaks from this field right now. I've mentioned it previously as well, that we've gone from that very essential, necessary phase about 20 years ago, where open access to publications was like the first focus, that was a very technical discussion at times. We've now really gone through a process where there is a much bigger emphasis on, well, what is this for? You know, we are making open access work. There is a lot still to be done there to keep making that work for researchers, for research communities. But there is now also, you start from that emphasis on this needs to serve a purpose. This needs to, in our view, lead to more positive research cultures. And that is something that you can already see quite clearly in the shared vision, that we're along with that process, we're moving along in that maturity and that comprehensive ambition of it. Open science, much like research assessment reform, which my colleague will say, is a means to an end. The way that we shape something like open science has to be shaped in a way that serves our ultimate goals and purposes. So, James?
Yes, and as Bregt said, what this boils down to is moving away from parallel siloed policy activities on research assessment on the one hand and open science on the other, to aligning those discussions and activities and recognizing that under the umbrella of research culture, together they can better improve research cultures and enable the quality and impact of research. And that's one of the shared core missions across our membership. As Bregt already mentioned, this has been a multi-year project which started in 2024 with a membership survey looking at the intersections of open science and research assessment at a policy and strategy level, amongst all our members. We then hosted a series of discussions with our members in early 2025, a 3-part workshop series exploring different dimensions of those survey results. Later in 2025, we hosted a tendered research project with a research team looking at the academic context of the links between open science and research assessment, again under the umbrella of research cultures. And we will very shortly be publishing this shared vision and set of recommendations. And so now we'll go through some of the key results of each of those steps, which will then take us back to that shared vision that has just been presented. So firstly, on the membership survey, the results we'll present came from a survey across all our members. 36 of our 40 member organizations participated. That's a very high level of participation compared to a lot of the surveys that we run. And I think that speaks to the centrality of both of these policy topics. As we've already highlighted, our membership comprises both funding and performing organizations. So the results reflect two different but often very connected perspectives.
So that is where I take over. We're going to just look at a couple of the results that we got from our members through the survey, because that really was the start in 2024, where the experts of our members, both on open science and research assessment reform, came together for a meeting. They started discussing things together, and they said, this has been a really good discussion from our different expertises, but we need to know a little bit more about how our organizations, we as funders, we as performers, what does open science actually mean? What does research assessment reform actually mean for us? Can we do a collective survey to really get down to it? And that is what this is. This is what we've done as a first step in 2024. First very obvious question that we asked is, well, does your organization actually have an open science policy, either in full open science or just one of its elements? Is there something on paper somewhere that shows that you have a strategy on this? And the answer is yes. Essentially, yes. You see up top that most of the organizations say, yes, we have something on paper. And not only that, a lot of members also say, well, we're not alone in this. Very often, we also take our cue from especially the national or regional level, like policymakers that we interact with. That is something that we look at as well. They have their own policies on this, and also internationally, that is something that we look at as well. So basically, the first result was yes, most of the members have a policy in place, and they are not isolated. They also have a context in which they work where other policies interact across multiple levels. James, the next slide, please. The next obvious question after that was, and this is a slide that I love because there's so much going on here, is we tried thinking, and I still remember I was doing this, James, so sort of like, what are all the possible elements that we could ever imagine that is part of an open science policy? And we just asked the members, well, if you have a policy, which of these possible elements, all of these, which are a part of that policy? And then you can see a very interesting slide here. You can see basically on the sort of the top right corner, very much in line with the expectations, is that open access to publications, open access to research data, that is almost universally a part of these policies. And that's where we started about 25 years ago. These are sort of the more mature, important elements that are part of these policies. They're always basically a part of a policy if a policy is in place. But beyond that, beyond sort of the maturity of open access and the central focus on open access to publications and data, very interesting, we're seeing more than just that. If you start looking down to the middle there's sort of a middle section where up to about 50% of the membership says, actually, there's more than just open access. We are also interested in infrastructure in our policies. We have something there we have something on infrastructure. I'm seeing other types of outputs as well. Software is something that we saw come up, citizen science. So these are also things that are coming up. And then if you keep going down the slide, you look at sort of the bottom left corner there. Now we're thinking just about sort of like 25% of the membership, up to 25% of the members. But then you see that open evaluation is starting to be a part of these policies. Open research methods is starting to be a part of these policies. So there's a lot in this slide to say that open science is, yes, open access is very important, but it is more than just that. I also am seeing that we probably need to speed up a little bit. So I'm going to go over some key issues in the next slide. We asked, for example, also, why are you working on open science anyway? Like, why would you do this? We asked, well, what are the values? What are you trying to achieve here? Our members asked us, well, told us, said, well, research quality and research impact, the top two there. Quality, integrity, collective benefit. Our members said, if we're working on open science, it's because we believe that it's good for the research quality and we believe it's good for the impact of research. A bit of a jump down, equity, fairness, diversity, inclusiveness. You see that these are not unimportant for our members when they are working on open science, but less so than research quality and research impact. That is one of the things that we are seeing and we're discussing with our members, like, how does that connection work? Next slide, please, James. We also asked, what are the primary drivers for your organization to work on open science? And again, you sort of see very similar that that they all have their policies, more or less, and they're telling us here, as a result of this question, well, my own organization is the driver here. We're in the driver's seat. We have a policy. We are driving what we're doing here. But again, we're not doing it completely by ourselves. They are telling us, and you can see that in the next couple of options, is, the national ministries, national policies, international organizations, those are driving this as well. Again, you see sort of that multi-level effort through the policy rungs that is driving open science. Our own organizations, our member organizations are saying we have a mandate, we're driving this ourselves, but we are very closely connected to all those other levels. A little bit less, you can see there is sort of research community, good practices. What is going on there? We're still discussing that with our members. But again, the point is they're not doing it completely by themselves. They are driving their open science policies, but not just by themselves. Next slide, please, James. We also asked challenges, since sort of time is very quickly running out. I can't go through this entire slide, unfortunately, but what we can say is that both in the development and the implementation of their strategic approaches to open science, our members are predominantly sort of looking at financial concerns. They're looking at concerns of the impact on researchers and their careers. That was sort of quite consistently across the board the top two. There is a whole other list of challenges that you can look at here, but it's definitely sort of the financial side of things and the concerns over what is this going to do to the careers of researchers. We're talking about people's careers. That is very important. Our member organization taking that very, very serious. And then the next slide, James, I think that's already you. Great.
Yes, then we looked at how those strategic approaches translate into practice. And of course, for our member organizations, that's done through their research assessment processes. So we first asked our members, and here focusing on our funding members, how their organization includes open science as part of funding requirements for funded projects. We see that the majority do include some open science requirements. And when we look at which open science elements are included there, we see that familiar pattern that Bregt has already explained, where the focus really remains predominantly on open access to research outputs, so research articles and open and fair data. And then there is a kind of long tail of emerging elements that are starting to be recognized, but it's not yet common practice. We also asked how information is collected in applications for these elements. And for funding requirements, we see that most commonly it's collected through either dedicated questions or through dedicated criteria. but that there are organizations that are now starting to develop narrative descriptions for collecting these types of open science contributions for funded projects. We then asked the similar set of questions, but this time focusing on researcher recognition processes. So this is the assessment of the track record of researchers. And this section is applicable both to funding and performing organizations. We see a much more mixed picture here. And I think this speaks to the differences between ex ante assessment, so assessment looking at the future proposed elements of research projects, and ex post assessment, which looks at the track record, what has already been done by researchers. Again, however, we see that same pattern re-emerge here, but maybe to a slightly less pronounced level. And I think the reason for that is clear on the next slide. We see much more focus on information being collected through narrative descriptions. Particularly here, I think this signal is the use and implementation of narrative CVs and how that enables researchers to describe more of the open science activities that they involve themselves in and then be recognized for those activities.
Yes, and that's me again, open science monitoring. Just very briefly talking about that a little bit. This was something we also asked about because it's very important as open science becomes more ambitious. And we felt, well, what are you doing in terms of monitoring? We asked our member organizations. So James, if you can go to the next slide. Very briefly, we asked, are you doing any sort of monitoring? They said, largely yes, we're doing some sort of monitoring, or at least we have plans to develop that in the future. There's only a small minority says we really don't monitor anything here. So that's a good start there. So James, next slide. But then again, seeing that sort of pattern emerge is if you then ask, well, what are you monitoring in terms of open science? Again, you see open access to publications especially, but also data. That is something that is being monitored. And then after that, very quickly, the responses go down. There's not much monitoring beyond those sort of core mature elements like open access to publications and data. That is something that's very important for us to know. Something that's very important for the member organization themselves to know that this is something where there is a lot of room for improvement, especially as we are building out open science as a more comprehensive ambition. So James, next slide. One very important question we also asked is, well, that monitoring, that research information that you collect, do you yourself make that openly available? A very small minority says yes to all of it. All of our research information is openly available. And then there's a big number of members that says yes, some research information is available that we collect is openly available. Again, that was a question we wanted to ask, very similar, because, well, is there room for improvement here? Yes, clearly there is. That is something that our members are also now very clearly aware of, that is something that they can work on together. Not just making it openly available, but how can we do that? How can we do that in an aligned fashion across Europe? And James, I think that was already the last. Conclusions, yes. Next slide. Ultimately, then, that was our starting point, the survey 2024. We're finding that the Science Europe membership is, our member organization, they're actively shaping and contributing to developments on open science and its implementation through assessment processes. They also very clearly have sort of not only a shared direction and common drivers, they also have common challenges. But throughout the survey results, and we've sort of talked about it throughout, is there is also still a lot of work to be done, not just on individual aspects of it, but also in terms of connecting their actions, their agendas, and their strategies. And to come back to the beginning there, putting this all within the banner of aiming for positive research cultures, really seeing open science and research assessment reform as means to an end, I think has helped our discussion between our members enormously in terms of starting to make those connections. If you start to discuss not just open science as sort of, that is a lot of work that's going on there. You're not just discussing research assessment reform, that is especially through Quagga, as a lot is happening there. If you look at both of those as contributing to essentially the same thing, building a more positive research culture, then you can start making those connections. You can start aligning and start discussing where you can help each other out between those policy communities. So that is what we took away from that survey, and then we were able to take it the next step. James.
Yes, so I think through that survey we built a quite comprehensive policy and practice picture of the state of the art, but we also wanted to then connect that to the academic context, the academic discussions that are going on in this area. So last year we commissioned a small research project looking at the contributions of open science to research cultures. We collaborated with a research team from No Center in Austria and CWTS at Leiden University in the Netherlands, with the idea that we wanted to explore a different angle than what we often heard discussed both in an academic and in a policy context. The usual story being that research culture needs to shift in order to enable the adoption of open science. And actually we wanted to flip that understanding around and say kind of, well, what does open science do to and contribute to positive research culture shifts? And that was the aim of this piece of work. And so the research question that was asked was, what findings have been reported regarding open science contributions to research cultures? And we wanted to explore more deeply in the academic literature what mechanisms produce these effects. Is it behavior change? Is it policy mandates? Is it training and guidance? What contextual factors enable or inhibit these contributions? And where are there knowledge gaps that we need to address in the future in order to better enable our policy and practice adaptations? And so the research team followed a systematic scoping review method where they initially found well over 3,000 articles that had possible links between open science and research culture mentioned. And then through a series of screening and exclusion steps, they whittled that list down to 62 articles that really discussed the specific link between open science and its contributions to research cultures. And they used that list of 62 articles, both from the academic literature and key grey literature, so policy studies as well, to write a literature review on the topic. Interestingly, when they looked at, of those 62 papers, what elements of open science were being discussed, again, we see that same pattern. So it's not only in the policy context that we see this pattern, but also in the academic literature, where the focus of discussions and activity is really on open access to publications and open and fair data sharing, most commonly, with very few studies looking at the more process-oriented elements like open research methods or open peer review. We also wanted to look at what are the outcomes of these studies where they mention the link between open science and research cultures. Do they talk about shifts in research culture in a positive direction, in a negative direction, or is it mixed? And you can see here that the majority were mixed, but then closely afterwards, there was a lot of positive links being made. I think this slide speaks to one of the main conclusions of that study and what we knew from our policy discussions already, that research cultures are very complex and there are many moving parts, and it's often difficult to know whether one specific intervention results in a specific action or outcome. And we see that in the academic literature, in academic studies as well. The literature review was organized around our shared values framework. And for each section, they summarize the key studies that have looked into the links between open science and research cultures from a collaboration perspective or from an autonomy and freedom perspective, I just want to highlight a couple of the results there. So firstly, on equality, diversity and inclusion, the studies that were picked up there show that open science can be an engine for more equal and inclusive research cultures, but careful implementation is needed. One particular study showed that publishing in open access journals can actually counter gender disadvantages in academic careers. It showed that women researchers at a certain career stage who published more in open access journals had comparatively higher salaries to other women researchers who published less in open access journals. However, it was also pointed out that there was a lot of care needed there because open science can, if not implemented correctly, either introduce new forms of bias or reinforce existing forms of bias that are in the system. Again, on integrity and ethics, the literature highlighted that open science can strengthen integrity and ethics as part of this research culture umbrella by making things like replication, registration, and transparency more broadly both legitimate and valued. We see that open science engagement by the research community strengthens scrutiny and accountability, but also potentially opens the door to certain vulnerabilities like predatory publishing, and can also lead to new forms of bias, again, through infrastructure inequalities. So research communities who have more or less access to open science infrastructure will see different research culture shifts in different directions. So the conclusions of that scoping review really highlighted that, yes, open science contributes to research culture, but its benefits are uneven and very context dependent, that positive effects of open science are often realized in environments where not only one specific intervention matters, but it's how they are mixed together. So a policy mandate on its own won't work, but when it's supported by appropriate training, guidance, and infrastructure, it can create positive research culture shifts. That it's not only about the outcome of the actions we're aiming for, but also the way in which research organizations like our members reach those outcomes. So the methods that they employ and the processes that they follow need to be just and equitable. And finally, that we need more research looking at these types of questions to better understand how open science specifically contributes to positive research culture shifts and in turn improve the quality and impact of research.
So I see we're sort of just about at the end of the time here, but just very briefly to wrap this up, then we're now at the end where we started with this shared vision. Based on all of this, what we've done together with our members, together with partners, looking at the academic context, we are now very much going in a direction where we are starting to connect the work on open science, connect to work on research assessment reform as combined contributors to positive research cultures. And James, if you want to give the next slide, this is just a quick preview of what we're going to publish next week. These are recommendations by and for our member organizations, so by and for public funders and research performers about how they can strategically align their actions. You can see some inspiration there from Brian Nosek's Triangle of Culture Change, but we are very much focusing on the alignment across recommendations about open and accessible community-governed infrastructures, community capacity and support for open science, recognizing and incentivizing open science, and scholarly communication reform policies. You see that we follow the sort of, making it possible, making it easy, rewarding, and required. And we're also going to be mentioning the framework conditions for all of this, which is the general capacity building and also monitoring and evidence gathering. As we become more ambitious, I've already mentioned, monitoring and evidence gathering is going to be more and more important to make sure we know what the impact is of the policies we are developing together. So that is the final report that's going to come out next week. And hopefully we maybe still have a little bit of time for questions, because that's it for us.
Wonderful, both. Thank you so much for such an interesting presentation. Really useful piece of work there. Some really fascinating results, I think. So we are running slightly over, but if anyone has any burning questions, please do add those to the chat. I can see that we have a couple there already, so I'll quickly look to those. So Lavinia has asked, your results show that fair data is at the top of your members' attention. However, a recent UK reproducibility network survey showed that fair data is among the least known and used open research practices by researchers in the UK. Would you have any thoughts about this apparent mismatch?
That might not be that much of a mismatch. I think one of the things with this survey, it's very descriptive, the 2024 survey. In terms of a lot of the results that we're getting, they're giving us an indication of where our members are thinking. But there's usually a lot more to discuss just behind those results. Even when we were developing the survey, our members were already asking as well, it's great to get this, to get like a description of where we are all taking action, what we're really thinking about, what's in our policies. But there's so much to discuss behind this. Like if we say in the survey, our members say, well, if we tick that box, like, yes, open and fair data is a big part of our policies. What does that actually mean? That can mean very different things, how something is built into a policy. So what we've done is that we said, okay, let's do the survey, of course. Let's get the results there, so we have something in common to talk about. But let's then also actually discuss those results more in depth. So after the results came out 2024, we had a number of internal workshops between our members to look at those results, really go through them, make sure that everything was there, that we could learn from them, and if we were clear on how we're interpreting these things. I don't have an exact reply for your question. What exactly is then fair data for our members? I should look that up. But just to give you a sense of, yes, it's good to be, I think these are sound results from the survey, but you should not just take them at face value. You should also be a little bit critical and say, like, look, this gives a very strong indication, but we will have to discuss this a bit further. And that's what we are doing with our members. We gave a couple of examples, for example, also on monitoring, where we got a first good descriptive indication of, okay, there's room for improvement, but follow-up discussion and follow-up work will then have to decide what that actually means. And I think this is very similar.
Thank you very much. And we have time for one other question, hopefully. Christopher Warren has asked, does your work indicate where the research community is looking for leadership on future changes in research culture? Academic research groups, professional services such as library, research development, third-party groups like UKRI or yourselves? Is there a sense of, no, you go first in this?
Yes, maybe I can take that one. I think that's a really key question and something that we have been asking ourselves, our members, and they've been asking their respective national systems for a number of years now. I think what's particular about research culture is that shifting in a positive direction is not a top-down process or a bottom-up process. It's a mix of the two. And I think it's highlighted in when we go right back to the phrasing of our strategic priority, contributing to the evolution of research cultures. I think we'd initially drafted driving as if research funding organizations were really the driving force behind research cultures. And we felt that's not correct. Actually, it's how we enable the community to make those shifts in research culture themselves in the direction that is most suitable for their daily work and the outputs and outcomes that they provide. So from a membership organization like Science Europe and related to our members, I think it's more about supporting the community in stepping forward and creating the change that they want to see in their national systems and in their teams and in their institutions. But it does require some top-down support as well. It requires investment. It requires infrastructure, as we've highlighted there. So I think it's a topic that requires a shared direction from all levels rather than just a top-down or bottom-up approach.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. So we probably should end the questions there. I just wanted to ask what is next for Science Europe in this area, and if there is more to come, would you be happy to come and tell us about that at a future event?
Happy to just very briefly talk about this. So basically our members are just going to continue working on this and going to continue working this along the lines that we've presented here. One of the things for Science Europe that's definitely now coming is that we had a multi-annual sort of strategy plan that we were following with the broad strokes of what we were doing as a collective that ran from 2021 to this year, and we are now developing the new multi-annual strategy plan. So everything you've heard here is going to be feeding into that. These are deliberations that are now happening at every level of our membership, from the experts all the way to the leadership. But it's this type of work, this type of sort of emphasis on where can we align our actions, where can we move forward collectively, that is going to play a big role in deciding what the next strategy plan for Science Europe is going to be. So Science Europe is most likely just going to continue to really be engaged and at times even a front runner in these fields based on all of this work.
And I think if I can just very briefly add to that, I think what we've shown in this project is that it is really beneficial to not look at policy areas in isolation. We've shown that for open science and research assessment reform, but we also want to look at that more broadly now. So how does integrity intersect with open science? Where does research security discussions come into that? So I think moving forward, rather than focusing on specific policy topics, we'll take a much more kind of cross-cutting view of how these interact with one another. And hopefully that can enable our members to create policies and practices in the future that are much more impactful and positive for the research communities they support.
Definitely sounds like really valuable piece of work, and definitely more useful things to come. Thank you again both for a really interesting presentation, and thank you to everyone who has joined us today, and apologies for keeping you a little longer than intended. There are more events obviously taking place for the GW4 Open Research Week, and there's still time to sign up for those. So do check out our programme, which has just appeared in the chat for you. And we hope to see you at some future sessions this week. But in the meantime, thank you very much, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you.